Hello friends, and welcome back to Dungeon Design in Zelda. In the last video, we discussed the Water Temple, which was by and large my most critical video to date. This one might be the opposite. Today, we're looking at the Lightning Temple, which is my favorite dungeon in the game. But before we get into that, a few things to discuss. First off, I have to offer my obligatory spoiler warning. During the course of this video series, nothing is off the table for discussion as long as I feel it is relevant to the dungeons here. So if you are avoiding any spoilers, go ahead and save this video into your watch later list, and come back after you've completed the dungeon featured here. With that out of the way, let's hop into things. So as usual, let's talk about dungeon order. I have gone over this with each of Tears of the Kingdom's dungeons so far, so I apologize for the redundancies here if you've been keeping up with the series. I'll try to keep it brief. That said, while the game is open and allows for these dungeons to be completed in any order, there is still an implied dungeon order that the game works to funnel you through. And of course, I ran a poll, just like I have with the previous 3 videos, this time asking people which dungeon they had done fourth. At the time of writing this script, the poll has 908 votes split between 5 options, with the Lightning Temple pulling in a strong 59%. So long story short, the majority of players, at least according to this small sample, waited to do the Lightning Temple fourth. And it makes complete sense why. This order is conveyed to us via NPC dialogue, such as where and when Purah will encourage us to go to, visibility of the 4 regional phenomena, and its placement on the map. Those who played Breath of the Wild will probably remember Vana Boris being the most difficult of that game's own 4 main dungeons, with the punishing Thunderblight Ganon as its boss fight. So it isn't a stretch to say that an aspect of that may have gotten internalized for us returning players, but even without that prior knowledge, I stand by this order. Lookout Landing acts as a base of operations in this game, and the Gerudo Desert is geographically the farthest from here, and according to Purah, the most dangerous to get to in terms of monsters. The terrain is also the most difficult to manage. The climate of the desert relies on needing both hot and cold protection, rather than one or the other. And of course, there is the very simple fact that the game has already nudged us through the other 3 dungeons. Combine all of these factors and it's clear that the Lightning Temple is intended to be done fourth. Another noteworthy bit of confirmation on this game's dungeon order is also found here in Lookout Landing. As each regional crisis gets completed, a representative of that region is sent here as a correspondent. As this occurs, each race also brings a banner with them, a symbol of their alliance. And no matter what order you do these dungeons in, these banners are placed in this same sequence: Rito, Goron, Zora, then Gerudo. I didn't mention this in prior videos, simply because of the fact that it wasn't information that is available to us, the player, until after the dungeons are completed. But hey, there it is for you, confirmation. So yes, that is the dungeon order that I believe they intended. So now that we know when and why we are heading towards the desert, let's look at the pre-dungeon questline to do leading up to the Lightning Temple. The usually calm Gerudo Desert lies beneath a sand shroud. Traffic between the Kara Kara Bazaar and Gerudo Town is halted, with those in the bazaar unaware of the state the town finds itself in. Concealed within the desert sandstorm, monsters roam about freely, most notably the imposing Gibdo. groups of these horrors spawning from newly formed hives. Gerudo Town itself sits in the center of the shroud and has been overrun. The typically bustling plaza is eerily quiet. Shops are barricaded, homes abandoned. Indeed, the town itself has fallen to the Gibdo. This isn't something I've touched on very much during this series, but as we reach the settlements impacted by each regional crisis, there is remixed music of the usual themes and a generally different atmosphere, and it is always great, but it is done best here. Rito Village was simply snowed over, but it was still Rito Village. Zora's domain was enduring a sludge problem, but you could still find the Zora here trying to deal with it. But walking into the usually lively Gerudo Town to find it abandoned in this state with this absolutely eerie piece of music is a whole other experience. The only sign of life here is Bozai. Remember him? Get out of here, man. The first time I walked into Gerudo Town on my first playthrough, I couldn't help but wonder just how far Nintendo was going with this story. Were they really killing off a huge amount of the Gerudo population? I knew Riju would be fine, she was in the trailers, but the rest of the Gerudo? This place gave me a very real sense of worry. But there is hope. The Gerudo are a resilient people. Searching the town will find clues, and indeed, beneath the plaza stairs is the entrance to the Gerudo underground shelter. We just have to find our way in, which actually isn't hard to do, but it is cool that they don't hand us this solution so readily, and instead just let us explore the town, investigate, and figure it out. In fact, this entire quest line leading up to the dungeon stands out as another high point in this game's main story. It has multiple scenarios that build toward the dungeon. It's a great change of pace. So first, inside the shelter, we'll talk to Boliara and get sent on our way to find Riju. After finding Riju and learning how to use her lightning strike ability, we receive word that the Karakara Bazaar is under attack. If you passed by it earlier, you may have seen the guards there investigating this structure. Well, we now learn that these are Gibdo hives, which yes, will infinitely spawn Gibdo. So we have to defend the bazaar from being overrun. Luckily, the Gibdo are vulnerable to electric attacks, such as Riju's lightning strike, as well as other elemental attacks, even Dazzle Fruit. So you should be able to manage no problem. This is already super fun on its own, but then it's taken a step further. As soon as we've repelled this attack and destroyed the hives, we learn that more hives have just appeared outside of Gerudo Town. Upon returning to town, we'll find the Gerudo militia here and ready to assist. Not only are we defending the town now, but we are able to make preparations. We can choose where barricades are set up and forces are deployed, including cannons. I didn't know you guys had these. This is just brilliant fun. My only nitpick would be that I'd rather there were simply more Gibdo during these attacks, because the whole scenario can go by pretty quickly. Even still though, fighting side by side with the Gerudo forces to repel the Gibdo swarm is just so different from any of the other dungeon lead-ups in this game. I think it speaks volumes that my only complaint with this questline is that I want more of it, because what is here is so fun. Once that is done, we're given a riddle. Riju consults an ancient monument that hints at how to find the dungeon. With a slice of information, we're let loose into the desert to figure it out. Just how I like it. I just want to quickly point out that the shrine atop Gerudo Town, as well as the cave connecting the shelter to the northern ruins, introduces to us this light reflecting mechanic using these mirrors. Both feature a puzzle that makes use of bouncing a light off of two mirrors to activate a mechanism. That mechanic also gets put to use here. The puzzle requires us to find these three mechanisms in the desert and configure them correctly so as to have this beam of light form a triangle around the desert. This feels oddly familiar. This mirror mechanic is going to be integral to the dungeon itself, so it's great to see the game easing us into this idea, giving us a rather straightforward introduction to it before the dungeon expands upon the concept. Overall, this dungeon lead up is fantastic, and a great change of pace from pretty much anything else in the game. Alright, once this is done, a massive structure will rise from the sand. But there is one more skirmish before heading inside. We'll actually be confronted by the dungeon boss here, Queen Gibdo. It's not often in Zelda games that we'll see a dungeon boss outside of the boss room that we fight them in, so it's always a treat when we actually do. Being able to fight them a little bit here before the dungeon kicks off a sense of rivalry and makes me feel more invested when the actual end of dungeon boss fight occurs, so I'm into it. That was a lot, but with Queen Gibdo withdrawing from the battle, we can finally head into the dungeon. Welcome to the Lightning Temple. So far, in each dungeon, we've discussed and disputed the naming conventions of these temples, which often have been given an alternate name via the subtitles, such as the Stormwind Arc and Gorondia. The Lightning Temple's subtitle is The Mural's Myth Risen from the Sand, which is more an acknowledgement of the dungeon being depicted in that mural beneath Gerudo Town rather than an actual alternate name. So the Lightning Temple is just the Lightning Temple. And you know what? I am okay with that. It is just as much a crypt, it seems, but the general layout and implicit lore surrounding this place make me feel inclined to accept its status as a temple, one built as a pyramid, specifically in a Mesoamerican style rather than the smoothed out Egyptian style that is probably most famous in real life. Honestly, the temple is beautiful. It has a striking appearance on the outside, but within you'll find plenty of art, mosaics, and gold flourishes. Among the murals found within are depictions of camels, loads of them, a hint perhaps towards the sort of inspiration that the ancient Sheikah may have used to design the divine beast of this region. There aren't many depictions of camels in the entire series, so these murals feel like a way to tie those elements together in universe. But it's not all art and beauty. This place is dark. Literally, not just in the figurative sense, with sarcophaguses and statues depicting ancient Gerudo warriors found throughout the place. In the era of Hyrule's founding, this may have been some kind of ancestral tomb, a final resting place for many of the Gerudo people. In terms of atmosphere, the temple is mysterious and ancient in the best way. A lot of people online have been saying it gives Indiana Jones vibes, and while it may strike some as a cliche, I really think this is an apt descriptor. There's this palpable feeling of intrigue as you descend down dark, cramped corridors filled with traps, ruins buried in sand that haven't been touched by civilization in who knows how many thousands of years. It makes you feel like an archaeologist, just as much as a legendary swordsman. I love it. There's something about just walking down these pitch black corridors that is just magical. I mentioned this way back in my Vah Rudania video, but there's always something intriguing to me about darkness in these games. When areas are so dark that it interrupts your vision. There's loads of areas that do this idea very well, the depths most notably, but it's really well done here in particular, and it makes sense it would be so dark. There's no windows. I love this place. The temple is at times open and branching, but also just as often claustrophobic, a stark contrast from what is usually a sprawling and open game. Maybe that's why that darkness hits so well here compared to the massive depths. Not to say the depths don't have a great atmosphere, they do. It's just a very different vibe. A couple notes before we get into the progression though. The music. As always, it builds upon itself as we make progress. There's a dedicated entry music for this linear section leading into the central room, which is fairly subdued and mysterious, with the odd piano key or trill to keep us on edge. Once the central room is reached, phase 1 of the track kicks in. It's got all the usual trimmings of a desert-level theme, but still slow and mysterious. Good stuff. Phase 2 amps things up a bit, with a tone that feels more hostile, but never dropping that feeling of mystique. Phase 3, on the other hand, is almost like an entirely new song. Mostly the instrumentation is the same, but the tone is a big shift, being far less subdued than the prior phases. Phase 4 also is a big departure. This track takes a lot of cues from the previous Gerudo-related themes, and overall is a lot more optimistic feeling. It's the last part of the dungeon music before the boss fight, so in a way, it almost feels like the music's celebrating your accomplishments of getting through here. So, as usual, the dungeon music is good stuff. It's ambient and mysterious when it needs to be, it amps up tension when you get deeper into the dungeon's depths, and then resolves in a satisfying way. I love it. Indeed, this is my favorite dungeon in the game, and as many would expect, it ends up being the closest that this game gets to giving us a traditional Zelda dungeon. Yes, it still follows the structure of having to activate a handful of terminals spread throughout the temple. But if you look at the way you progress through the dungeon, the overall structure here, it has all of the key points you'd look for in a traditional Zelda dungeon experience. A linear section, plenty of enemies, a large central room that the dungeon branches off from, and core mechanics that are used for puzzles and navigation. In particular, those aforementioned mirror reflecting mechanics, which are integral for both individual puzzles and a larger puzzle that intersects the entire core area of the dungeon. This is it. We asked for more traditional dungeons, well, we got one. And actually playing through this dungeon is a joy. The Lightning Temple can be pretty cleanly divided into two parts. This linear section of corridors starting from the foyer and leading up to the central room, and this branching area that expands out from and including the large central room. This is pretty typical Zelda dungeon stuff, and is exactly what the Water Temple lacked. I think if the dungeon had only one section or the other, then it would be pretty underwhelming as well. But the fact that they squeezed both into this structure made it a package deal makes it feel complete. Even still, during this first area, while it is essentially a linear series of hallways, there's still plenty of little nooks and crannies to explore, alcoves with optional little goodies and secrets. Plus, just about every room is filled with enemies and puzzles. The enemy variety isn't enormous here, but you know what? I'm okay with that because of which enemies they decided to put in here, namely the Gibdos. This really is the only dungeon that has what is essentially its own region-specific enemy type that isn't just an elemental version of another enemy. And these guys are just so creepy and perfectly fitting for this place. Another important thing that gets introduced to us in this first section, but is just as important in the second, is how Riju can get around. If you already watched my videos on the wind, fire, and water temples, then you probably saw this talking point coming. For those who haven't, here's some context. In those videos, I talked about how the sages had this weird ability to just keep up with the player. It made sense for Tulin because he can fly, and it never felt like that broke progression in any way because of how the level was designed. But for Yunobo and Sidon, it made no sense that they could essentially teleport to wherever the player is, especially in the Fire Temple, when the dungeon was so clearly designed to make use of these minecarts as a navigational challenge, only to have that design idea completely undermined. The Lightning Temple, on the other hand, completely fixes this and does exactly what I asked for. Riju cannot teleport to the player. If there isn't a walkable path for her to take, she will simply stand back and wait for you to make one for her. During this first section, we're introduced to this fact by the various traps that we can maneuver around, and then disable so she can catch up. This makes absolute sense. Link is incredibly mobile in this game, and his abilities like Recall can and should allow him to get through here. This concept gets put to even better use during the dungeon's second half. This latter portion of the dungeon all revolves around this large vertical chamber, which has a staircase leading up the bulk of it. The goal here is to activate 4 terminals to power up the elevator that leads to the boss room. The terminals are spread out in various side rooms that split off from different floors of this central room. However, that staircase does not extend all the way up. Riju does not have a paraglider to ride up this updraft, nor can she use Ascend. It has to make sense for her to reach these places, so the navigational challenge becomes a puzzle of how to first unlock these areas for yourself, and then for Riju so she can activate the terminals. This is exactly what I've been asking for. In my previous 2 videos about the fire and water temples, when I brought this point up about the cheese factor, I had gotten a few comments saying that I had somehow missed the point, that removing the sage's ability to keep up with the players would somehow undercut the value of Link's mobility, or go against the grain of how the game overall was designed. So to those people, I say this: I get where you're coming from. I really do. It's great to be able to approach things from different angles and solve puzzles in a variety of ways. But this dungeon doing exactly that and being so good, it kind of proves my point. Plus the dungeon being a change of pace compared to how we approach things outside in the overworld is a good thing. Variety is good. We're doing a more curated story section. We should have to think things through and approach them differently. So yeah, the cheese factor that I've talked about so much in these videos is basically non-existent here. There are still multiple solutions to some of these puzzles, but you still have to engage with what's here in order to make progress, and that is the perfect balance. The rooms are also laid out in a way that you can't often ascend into unintended areas, though there is a secret room that you can only get to by using Ascend. You wouldn't know it's there unless you were actually looking at the map. Cheeky, I like it. Even still, you can't skip over things with this movement option because Riju won't teleport to you. You can technically ascend into the boss room, but without Riju there to help you destroy this Gibdo structure, the fight won't start. Say what you will about the cheese factor being in place to incentivize outside the box thinking, I get that, but this dungeon was so clearly designed to curb any cheesing, all while still letting you approach things in multiple ways using the game's core mechanics. Speaking of those puzzles, I mentioned mirror puzzles earlier. There's a shrine at the top of Gerudo Town, the Valley of Silent Statues, and the Red Pillars puzzle, all before the dungeon. Multiple failsafes in place to ensure you've learned this mechanic of bouncing a beam of light between mirrors. This dungeon now puts it all to use. Although, just in case you needed a refresher, the room right before the central room has one final easy version of this before the rest of the dungeon takes the concept and runs with it. There are a couple of light sources, one on the top floor and one in this side room, which we need to redirect into the central room. There are a few permanently placed mirrors on tracks in the central room that can be repositioned, as well as a handful of mobile, disposable mirrors around the dungeon. And in order to unlock the various side corridors, we need to activate light sensors that are placed around this central room by bouncing these beams of light. This is awesome. Both aesthetically and mechanically, this feels in many ways like a blend between Ocarina of Time's Spirit Temple and Wind Waker's Earth Temple. In any case, I am always a sucker for these mirror puzzles whenever they show up in pretty well any Zelda game. This isn't quite on the scale of that massive Earth Temple puzzle, but that was really one final challenge to unlock a single door. This is a bit smaller in scale, but because it is the core puzzle used in the central room, it has greater utility, meaning you have to engage with it throughout more of the dungeon. It's great, brilliant stuff, really. And still, the dungeon finds time to incorporate smaller individual room puzzles in those side corridors that we have to unlock. In order to reach and activate each terminal, we'll have to complete some challenge, save for maybe the first one on the bottom floor. So, in no particular order, the terminals are activated like this. Find the hidden passageway into this small room adjacent to and visible from the elevator, and activate the terminal. Leave Riju behind and ride this updraft to the top floor. Reposition the mirrors to bounce light around the central room, which unlocks this hidden hallway. Battle the enemies in here, then use some Zonai devices to reflect light onto this sensor to open this gate and activate the terminal. Reposition the mirrors again to unlock this corridor so that you can drop into this room and open this gate, which will now allow Riju to reach this room so you can activate the terminal. And finally, either use a disposable mirror or line up these rotating panels so that you can shine light in from this side room into the central room, which opens this final hidden passageway. Disable the trap so Riju can get in here, stop this mechanism from spinning so you can reflect light onto this sensor to open this hatch, then reflect light again, provided you've stopped these spike traps from blocking the way, so you can activate one final sensor and open this gate and activate the terminal. And oh god, it is so refreshing to write this out because these puzzles actually have multiple steps. Feels good. Even still, in bullet points, they might still sound pretty simple, but I'd like you to keep in mind that 1. These terminal puzzles don't even kick in until halfway through the dungeon. 2. These rooms are full of enemies in addition to these multi-step puzzles. 3. These are bullet points, so it sounds simple because I'm going over it in the most bare bones way possible. And 4, I'm only writing out the various steps to the puzzle, not even taking into account time spent figuring this stuff out. So yeah, it's great. You know, after making some pretty negative videos recently, this has been refreshing. Like, truly cathartic to write out. It feels good to gush about loving something. With all of that said, once we've battled our way through these corridors and activated all 4 terminals, we can finally ride the elevator and confront the dungeon boss. It's up to us to initiate the boss fight by destroying this structure blocking the secret stone. Once we do, however, we'll be confronted by Queen Gibdo. She's back and ready for more. Visually speaking, this is a great boss design. She's like Mothula meets a Redead, and she is massive to boot. The scope here is great. None of the blights even came close to being this big. And something about the way these like pouch-like sections on the Gibdo's necks move and those segmented bone-like appendages, something about it all is just unsettling in the best way. It's a minor detail, but the way her antennae glow, they almost look artificial in a way, but it's visually quite striking. The hue makes me draw a connection to the hives that she uses to spawn in reinforcements. Maybe it's a way she interacts with the hives. Oh, I should quickly mention the music here. It's awesome. The instrumentation is exactly what you'd expect from desert-themed boss fight, which is fine and all, not breaking any new ground with the instrument choices. The actual composition though, that's where this piece shines. It's high energy, bombastic, and dramatic. It shifts between dangerous and triumphant wonderfully, and that percussion just never lets up the tension. Fantastic. As for actually battling her, this is good stuff. This concept applies to the other Gibdo as well, but Queen Gibdo is only really vulnerable after being struck by an elemental attack. Otherwise, you'll only do a very small amount of damage, chipping away at her health. So, Riju's Lightning Strike or any other elemental attack at your disposal like Shock Fruit or Fire Fruit are going to be hugely useful in this fight. Queen Gibdo will fly around the arena, lobbing tornadoes, spitting acid at you, or just trying to physically overpower you, which she can do to great effect if you're not careful. Couple this with the fact that 4 hives are spread out across the arena, which will infinitely spawn reinforcements to try and overwhelm you during the fight's second phase, and you've got the hardest boss fight in this game yet. And I love that. You can, of course, destroy these hives, which will make things less hectic for you. Not just because it reduces the amount of enemies spawning in, but also because a light source will be revealed, which can be turned against your enemies. Even the queen is vulnerable to the light, if you can successfully reflect a beam at her, assuming you brought a mirror in with you. But of course, there is specific timing as to when those hives can be destroyed, and you're going to be swarmed and under enemy fire the rest of the time, so you've got to be on your toes all throughout the fight. Like the temple as a larger whole, this boss fight really does strike that perfect balance between classic Zelda boss and new open-air Zelda boss fight. She has specific vulnerabilities like a classic boss, but you still have multiple ways to approach the fight, stun her, and open her up to attack, which is great. Once she's defeated, we'll of course get our heart container as usual. Riju will get her secret stone and awaken as a sage, and yeah, this is the 4th video now. You know the joke. If you couldn't tell, I love this dungeon. It's pretty telling that every complaint I had with the water temple is completely fixed within this dungeon. It does so much right. A palpable feeling of mystery and danger with lots of enemies and traps? Check. A bunch of individual puzzles that can be approached in several ways but never feeling totally cheesable? Check. Being huge with loads of floors that remain interconnected via a large central room? Check. A core mechanic that gets used for a larger puzzle that weaves throughout the dungeon? Check. And of course, the vibes. Atmosphere is so important, and check. The first section is so tense, dark, and creepy. The dungeon has tons of secrets and optional goodies, while never watering down its core objectives or identity. It wonderfully teases us with areas that are visible but inaccessible, forcing you to explore and figure out how to approach it, and it always introduces to you these concepts at a smaller scale before expanding upon it, like that teased area idea I mentioned. First, at the bottom of the central room, you can see this terminal behind this mesh, but the hidden pathway there isn't too hard to actually find. Shortly after, we'll find a terminal locked in this fenced-off area, and only by exploring thoroughly and engaging with the dungeon's core mechanics will we find the way to drop in from above, so that we can open it from the inside and bring Riju in. It's clear we need to get in there, but it is up to you to figure out the how. The same introductory logic is applied to the mirror puzzles. This room has a simple one, then it is expanded upon in the central room, and before you know it, you're rearranging mirrors and opening up hatches and bouncing light all over the place like a pro. And it makes you feel so smart for pulling it off. Same goes for the traps. We're disabling some simple minor traps in the first section like flame walls and rolling boulders, and then later we have multiple traps in a single hallway that are also combined with the mirror puzzles. They introduce them separately and then squeeze them together. I know, I keep talking about it, but the atmosphere is perfect, which is of course aided by a wonderful soundtrack. Initially, in my script, I had written that this was 100% a traditional Zelda dungeon brought into a modern game, a true return to form. However, now at the end of this script, after vigorously studying this place and going through a third rewrite, I've changed my stance. This is not a traditional Zelda dungeon. It's something better. This is the perfect blend of dungeon formulas. It takes all of the strengths of a traditional dungeon and infuses those strengths into the new style of open-air Zelda, the perfect balance. I'd like to take a quick moment here to thank you for watching this video. And special thanks goes out to my channel members here on YouTube, as well as my supporters on Patreon. You guys make this all possible. So thank you to Greymage, Brenda, Tetra, Justin, Midnight Naomi, Bunny, and Stefan, as well as all of the folks whose names you're seeing on screen right now. You guys are awesome. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye.